The night my brother stood up at his own promotion dinner and pointed at me across the table, I had a choice. I could let him finish. Or I could leave. I stayed. The look on his face when the CEO cleared his throat and said, "Actually, Kevin, I think there's something you should know about your sister." I want to say I felt nothing. But that would be a lie. I felt everything. My brother Kevin had always been the one our family talked about at Christmas. The one our mother framed photos of on the living room wall. The one our father introduced to strangers at church with that particular lift in his voice, that pride that cost nothing but meant everything when you were the child receiving it. Kevin got his MBA at 32. Kevin got married to a woman our parents adored. Kevin made VP at Hartwell Consumer Goods before he turned 40. Which is why we were all sitting in the private dining room of Brasserie 44 on a Thursday evening in November, raising glasses of Cabernet that cost more per bottle than I made in a day of scrubbing other people's baseboards. At least, that's what my family believed about how I spent my days. I had driven myself to the restaurant in my work van, the white one with the magnetic sign on the side that read Brightside Home Services in blue lettering. I peeled the sign off before pulling into valet, old habit. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I'd learned, over years of quiet observation, that people treat you differently once they decide who you are. I preferred to control the timing of that decision. The valet had barely glanced at the van. Inside, the hostess led me through a room that smelled of aged wood and melting butter, past tables of people who wore their confidence like expensive coats. I was wearing a dress I'd bought 3 years ago for a conference in Phoenix. It still fit. That felt like a minor victory. Kevin was already there when I arrived, stationed near the bar with his wife Michelle and 2 of his colleagues, laughing at something I hadn't heard. He spotted me, and his expression flickered, not unkind, exactly, but recalibrating. Like a man mentally moving furniture around a room he hadn't expected to share. "You made it," he said, leaning in for a half hug. "I wasn't sure with your schedule. I rearranged a few things," I said. He nodded the way people nod when they're not really listening. Michelle gave me a warmer hug and said my earrings were pretty. I thanked her and meant it. Michelle had always been the buffer between Kevin and whatever version of me he couldn't quite place. Our parents arrived 12 minutes later with our mother's sister, Aunt Carol, who treated every family gathering like a reunion she'd been dreading and attending for 40 consecutive years. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and Bengay and said, "Rachel, sweetheart, you look tired. Are you eating enough?" "I'm fine, Aunt Carol. Working too hard again." She patted my cheek. "Your brother looks wonderful, doesn't he? VP. Can you believe it? Your father's beside himself." I looked at my father across the room, watching Kevin shake hands with a man in a charcoal suit, and I could see exactly what Aunt Carol meant. He was glowing. He had his hand on Kevin's shoulder and was nodding along to a conversation he'd probably only half understood, but the pride coming off him was so genuine it was almost hard to watch. I couldn't remember the last time my father had looked at me like that. Actually, I could. I was 9 years old, and I'd won a spelling bee. Dinner began at 7:30. The private room held 16 people, Kevin's direct team, his boss Garrett Hutchins and Garrett's wife, and then our family occupying the far end of the table like a separate country. I was seated between Aunt Carol and a cousin I barely knew who spent most of the meal staring at his phone. The food was excellent. I didn't mention that I knew the executive chef. I'd hired him away from a restaurant in Denver 2 years ago. I simply enjoyed the salmon and listened to the table move through its rhythms. Shop talk from Kevin's colleagues. Gentle probing questions from our mother about grandchildren. Aunt Carol's theories on why the weather had been strange lately. Then Kevin stood up. I noticed the shift in the room before he even tapped his glass. These moments have a particular energy. People who know a speech is coming lean back slightly, settle in, arrange their expressions into attentive warmth. Kevin had always been comfortable in front of an audience. He'd been giving toasts since he was 23. "I just want to say a few words," he started, smiling around the table. "Because this whole night has felt a little surreal and I want to actually mark it somehow. Hartwell has been my home for 11 years. Getting this promotion feels like something I've been quietly working toward for most of my adult life, and to have all of you here to celebrate it." He paused. And for a moment he looked genuinely moved. "I'm grateful." Applause, warm and sincere, rippled around the table. "I also want to acknowledge my family," Kevin continued, and his gaze moved down the table toward us. He smiled at our parents, who looked like they might float right off their chairs. He nodded at Michelle. Then his eyes landed on me. And I watched something shift in his expression, that same barely there recalibration from earlier. Except now there was an audience, and Kevin had always performed better with an audience. "My sister Rachel is here tonight," he said, and I felt the room's attention turn toward me. "She runs a cleaning business. Which is, it's honest work. Rachel's always been the kind of person who doesn't mind, getting her hands dirty." He chuckled, and a couple of his colleagues chuckled with him. That automatic laughter that fills whatever space a person in authority creates. I think some people are just built for that, right? And some people are built for the boardroom. Our parents produced one of each. I held my glass and did not change my expression. My mother was looking at her plate. She knew how that had landed. She wasn't a cruel woman, she just never learned how to stop Kevin once he'd built up momentum. My father laughed. Not a big laugh. A small, agreeable one. The kind you give when you've heard the punchline before and you no longer have the energy to examine why it bothers you that it's at someone else's expense. Garrett Hutchins, Kevin's CEO, was looking at me with an expression I recognized. Not pity. Discomfort. The kind that comes when a person with power witnesses something that doesn't sit right and is deciding whether to intervene. I gave him the smallest possible shake of my head. "Not yet." He blinked, and then, to his credit, he caught himself and went back to his wine. Kevin finished his toast without further incident. The table applauded again. Michelle touched his arm when he sat down and smiled at him with a warmth I found it difficult to fully resent, because Michelle genuinely loved my brother and couldn't be held accountable for not seeing what she'd never been shown. After dinner, while the table broke into smaller conversations over dessert, Aunt Carol leaned toward me and said quietly, "He doesn't mean anything by it." "I know," I said. "He's proud of himself, he just gets." "Aunt Carol." I touched her hand. "I'm okay." And I was. What I felt in that moment wasn't the burning humiliation I might have felt 10 years ago. It wasn't even anger, exactly. It was the particular calm that comes from knowing something other people don't know yet, from holding a card close to your chest for so long that the weight of it becomes ordinary. I had been carrying this for 3 years. Tonight, I was setting it down. I excused myself after dessert and stepped into the corridor near the coat check, pulling out my phone to send a single text. "We're wrapping up. Are you ready?" The reply came in under 2 minutes. "Whenever you are." I went back to the table, ordered a coffee and waited. What my family knew about me. I was 38, divorced, no children, lived in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of town. I had started a residential cleaning business in my early 30s, which my mother referred to as Rachel's Little Company in the same tone she used for Kevin's son's lemonade stand. I drove a white work van. I wore comfortable shoes. I came to holidays with wine and left early because I always had an early job the next morning. What my family did not know, Brightside Home Services was not a little company. It was a regional franchise operation with 47 active locations across 9 states, 212 full-time employees and gross annual revenue of just under $18 million. I had built it from $1,200 and a second-hand floor buffer in the spare bedroom of my first apartment 7 years after my divorce. 4 years after I'd put my MBA night school application in the recycling bin because my ex-husband had told me I wasn't the ambitious type. I was the ambitious type. I just didn't need anyone to know it while I was building. The restaurant we were sitting in, Brasserie 44, was one of 3 upscale dining establishments I had acquired as passive investments over the past 4 years through a holding company called Clearwater Group. Kevin's company had hosted 3 client dinners here in the last 18 months. I had reviewed the reservation requests myself, which I mention not because I had done anything about them, but because the irony had not been lost on me. When Hartwell Consumer Goods began looking for new equity partners 2 years ago, Clearwater Group was among the investors they approached. We had come in at 14%. By the end of last year, through a secondary offering, we were sitting at 19%, enough to warrant a seat at the table during major capital decisions, not enough to show up in any database that Kevin would have thought to search. He had never searched. Why would he? His sister ran a cleaning company. Garrett Hutchins had known who I was for 8 months. We had met at a regional business summit in Charlotte, where I had been presenting on franchise development and he had been on a panel about consumer goods distribution. We'd had a 40-minute conversation over coffee that had ended with him looking at me with an expression I recognized, the same expression people got when they realized they had severely underestimated someone and were recalculating at speed. "Kevin Mitchell is your brother," he'd said, not quite a question. "He is." Does he know? No. A pause. Does he know about clear water? He knows I clean houses, I said. Garrett had been quiet for a long moment. Does that bother you? It did, I said. For a while. I had told him everything that afternoon, partly because I trusted him. He was the kind of man who understood what it cost a woman to build something quietly, without permission or applause, and partly because I had been carrying the weight of my double life for long enough that setting it down, even temporarily, with even one person, felt necessary. We had stayed in contact. He had never told Kevin. I hadn't asked him not to. He had simply understood. Tonight, at my text, he understood again. I was back at the table, halfway through my coffee, when Garrett stood. Before everyone heads out, he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man accustomed to rooms going quiet. When he spoke, I want to add something. Kevin smiled, relaxed. Probably assumed another round of congratulations. Kevin's promotion is well-deserved, Garrett said. He's a strong leader and a genuinely good person, and Hartwell is better for having him. That's real. He paused. But I want to address something that was said earlier this evening, because I think context matters and I don't believe in letting things lie when they can be corrected. The table had gone still. Kevin's smile was doing something uncertain at the edges. Kevin mentioned his sister's business tonight, Garrett continued, his eyes moving briefly to mine before settling on the middle of the table, neutral and even. I've had the pleasure of knowing Rachel for about 8 months now. I know what she's built. And I think her family deserves to know as well. My mother had stopped breathing. I could see it from across the table, that particular stillness that precedes an exhale. Brightside Home Services operates in 9 states, Garrett said. The franchise model Rachel developed has been cited twice in industry publications on small business scaling. Clearwater Group, her holding company, is a minority equity partner in several ventures, including. He glanced at my brother Hartwell Consumer Goods. Kevin made a sound I had never heard from him before. Rachel has been a member of our informal investor advisory circle for 2 years, Garrett said. She has sat in rooms where decisions about this company were made. And she has never once introduced herself as your sister, Kevin, which tells you something about the kind of professional she is. He picked up his glass. I simply think that's worth knowing. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. You could feel people inside it, thinking, recalculating. Kevin was staring at me. His face had gone through several things quickly: confusion, disbelief, and then something harder to name. Not shame, exactly. Something just before shame. My father had set down his fork. He was looking at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've walked past for years when someone tells you it's an antique. My mother pressed both hands flat on the tablecloth, as if she needed something to hold on to. Aunt Carol said, very quietly, "Oh my lord." Michelle reached over and put her hand on Kevin's arm. He didn't move. I finished my coffee. Set the cup down gently. Looked at my brother. "You don't have to say anything," I told him. My voice came out even. Not cold. I didn't want it cold. Just steady. "I know this is a lot." "Rachel," he started. "I know," I said again. Not to cut him off. Just because I did know. I knew the exact shape of what he was feeling. Because I had imagined this moment in enough variations to have mapped every possible version of it. The shock. The reordering. The particular humiliation of discovering that the person you had dismissed most thoroughly had been watching, quietly, with more information than you ever guessed. The drive home took 40 minutes. I had gone 2 miles when my phone rang. Kevin? I let it ring. Then my mother. I let that ring, too. I wasn't punishing them. I was giving everyone, including myself, the night to sit with what had happened before we tried to make words out of it. I had learned the hard way that the conversations you have in the first hour after a revelation are almost never the ones that count. My house was quiet when I got home. I poured a glass of water, changed out of my dress, and sat on the back porch with the neighbor's cat, who occasionally appeared on my steps like a small, unbothered consultant. The night was cold and clear. I could see a handful of stars above the tree line. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it wasn't what I had expected. I had imagined this for 3 years, the version of this night where my family finally understood the full picture. In that imagined version, I had always felt victorious. Complete, like a puzzle finally assembled, corner to corner. What I actually felt was tired, and something else that took me a few minutes to identify. Sad, maybe. Not for myself, For the years we had lost to a dynamic no one had ever questioned, because questioning it would have required someone to admit how much it had cost me, and nobody in my family had been ready to do that. My brother was not a bad man. That was the complicated part. He was a man who had been handed a role, golden child, the achiever, the one worth betting on, and had slid into it so naturally and so young that he had never been asked to look at what the role required of everyone around him. That's not innocence. But it's not the same as malice. I had not told the truth for 3 years because I was afraid of exactly this. The reconfiguring, the awkward calls, the family dinners where everyone would be slightly different with me, careful in a way that would feel like its own kind of distance. I had stayed quiet because silence, at least, was familiar. And because I had needed to know that what I was building was real, genuinely real, built on skill and work and the specific stubbornness of someone who had been told they weren't the ambitious type before I let anyone else have opinions about it. The first time I had tried to tell my family anything, I was 32, 3 months after my divorce, when I had landed my first commercial cleaning contract. A small office building, 1,200 square feet, 3 days a week. I had called my mother to tell her, excited in the way you are when you have done something real for the first time entirely on your own. That's wonderful, honey, she had said. Your brother just got a promotion. Did I tell you? He's going to be a regional manager. Isn't that exciting? I hadn't tried again. Kevin called 3 more times before midnight. I finally picked up on the 4th. Hey, he said. His voice had that particular texture of a person who has been rehearsing what to say and has decided to abandon the script. Hey. I've been sitting here for 2 hours trying to figure out what to say to you. A pause. I don't have it yet. You don't need to have it tonight. Rachel. He stopped. Started again. What I said at dinner. I know. I've been saying versions of that my whole life. He sounded like he was speaking carefully around something fragile. And you never said anything. What would I have said, Kevin? The silence stretched. Honest and uncomfortable. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what I would have done with it if you had. That was the most truthful thing my brother had said to me in years, and we both knew it. We can talk, I told him. Not tonight. But we can talk. He said okay. We said goodnight. I stayed on the porch until the cat got bored and left. And then I went inside and slept better than I had in months. The weeks that followed were imperfect and real in the way that actual change always is. My father called me on a Sunday morning, which he had not done in years, and asked if I would explain the business to him. Not in a networking way, not trying to leverage anything. He was asking the way a person asks when they are genuinely trying to understand how they missed something significant while standing close to it for a long time. I sat with him for 2 hours at his kitchen table and walked him through it, from the first contract to Clearwater Group, while my mother refilled our coffee and listened from the doorway. She didn't say much, but when I was getting ready to leave, she held my face in her hands the way she had when I was small, and she said, I'm proud of you, Rachel, and the simplicity of it, the plainness of it, with no asterisk, no pivot to someone else's accomplishment hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. Kevin and I had dinner, just the 2 of us, at a diner near his house 3 weeks after the Brasserie 44 night. He ordered a club sandwich and spent the first 20 minutes asking questions about the franchise model that were thoughtful enough to tell me he had actually done some reading before coming. Then he put his sandwich down and looked at me. I want to apologize, he said. Not just for the dinner. For the long version of it. The years of it. I looked at my plate. I know. I made you smaller than you were. In my head. In front of people. He shook his head. I think I needed you to be smaller. I don't know what that says about me, but I know it's true. It said something difficult. It also said something human. My brother was not the first person to need a foil. Someone to stand in contrast to their own success so that success could keep its shine. It's a thing people do without deciding to, and the harm of it doesn't require intention to be real. I didn't tell you, I said. I had reasons, but I let it go on longer than it needed to. That's on me too. You shouldn't have needed a reason, he said. No, I said. I shouldn't have. We sat with that for a minute, not trying to fix it, just letting it be what it was. What I understood, by the time the diner was clearing out around us, was that the relief I had been chasing, the revelation, the moment of being fully seen, had never really been about the money or the business. I had built Brightside and Clearwater for their own reasons. Because I needed to know I could, because David's words about the boardroom had lodged in me like a splinter I'd had to work out with my hands. The vindication was real, but it wasn't the point. The point was simpler and older. I had wanted my family to see me. Not the business, not the numbers or the holdings or the franchise agreements. Me. Rachel. The woman who had been sitting at their tables for 38 years, absorbing their peripheral love and their careful appraisals, quietly becoming more than any of them had thought to ask about. On my way home from dinner with Kevin, I stopped at the grocery store for the particular kind of ordinary errand that used to feel small but had started to feel, lately, like proof of something. I was standing in the cereal aisle when my phone buzzed with a message from Garrett. Board approved the new distribution pilot. Your instincts were right. Good call. I put my phone back in my pocket and stood there for a moment in the fluorescent light between the Cheerios and the granola, and I let myself feel it, not pride exactly. Something quieter and more durable. The specific satisfaction of a person who did the work, who built the thing, who stayed when it was hard and kept her own counsel when the people around her couldn't see far enough to be useful. Some people will never understand why I stayed quiet for as long as I did. They will say I should have stood up earlier, spoken louder, announced myself. Maybe. But here is what I know about silence. It isn't only the language of people who have given up. Sometimes it is the patience of a person who is still deciding the right time to be known. I had decided. And the diploma or whatever it was I had spent 7 years earning in rooms my family had never seen, had never, not even once, shaken in my hands.